Hello and welcome. I'm Roger Ream, and this is the Liberty and Leadership Podcast, a conversation with TFAS alumni, supporters, faculty, and friends who are making a real impact in public policy, business, philanthropy, law, and journalism. Today I have a very special guest on the Liberty and Leadership Podcast, Professor Michael Collins, who I will call Mike if he doesn't object. Mike has served on the TFAS faculty for some 30 years, both in our programs in Washington, D.C., and internationally in Prague and in Greece. The range of what he has taught is remarkable, including ethics and leadership course in our business and government affairs program, and many courses related to American culture and American society in Greece and in Prague. Mike has also had a long and distinguished career at Georgetown University, serving for many years as Dean of the School for Summer International and Continuing Education. In that capacity, he was our main contact at the university, where we partnered on organizing academic programs from 1970 and 2012. Mike's academic appointment was in the Department of English, where he was a distinguished professor. I should add, Mike is also an expert on all things Shakespeare and has written extensively on Shakespeare and modern poetry. More on that later. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for asking me.
There's a lot to talk about, so I'm going to get right into it. But first, could I ask if you could just talk a little about your upbringing? I know you attended Fordham University. And as I recall, you grew up in the Bronx. Is that right?
I grew up in the Bronx, yes. The more peaceful quarter of the Bronx, I would say, but the Bronx nonetheless, and proud of it, yeah. It's the northeast corner of the Bronx. If we had been taking a 10-minute walk, we would have been in Westchester. But
after Fordham,
New York University for a master's degree, 3 years in the Army, and then back to NYU, New York University, for a Ph.D. In English and American literature, as they said.
One question before we get to your Georgetown years and your work with TFAS that I had, that I don't know if I've ever asked you, but what prompted you to choose to study in graduate school English literature and get your PhD in that field?
Very simply, I just like literature. I enjoyed it very much. When I graduated, I was facing my 3 years in the Army, and one way of putting that off was to go on and get a master's degree. And the impetus for that was simply myself saying, I'd like to read more literature. I'd like to know more about it. And my father very generously said, okay, I'm happy. I'll pay your tuition for one more year. And I always appreciated that. And I did a master's degree in literature. When I was in the Army, I did some teaching for the University of Maryland and also teaching for the Army as well. And I kind of liked it. But I went back to NYU for the PhD primarily because I was interested in kind of finishing my education in literature, as strange as that sounds now. I don't think I was quite aware that the PhD is a professional degree. I thought I could continue enjoying myself in reading literature. But at the same time, I got interested in teaching. I enjoyed it very much. And so those kind of things came together, the education, the pleasure of teaching, and the inevitable result was looking for a job in education.
Well, it's been wonderful how you've brought so much of that to bear on the courses you've taught, not only at Georgetown, but in TFAS programs over the years. And not only Shakespeare, of course, but stories from Greek and Roman literature, modern poetry, film, of course, a number of films that I know you've shown at least pieces of in the classroom. And I've had the pleasure of sitting in many of your classes in Washington, D.C. and in Prague and in Greece. And I think using those devices has caused you to have such a lasting impact on the students who've been in the classroom with you. So I'd like to spend, the next half hour talking about a lot of these stories and in the literature that you've used and the reaction of the students to it and the lessons you've taught. So if I could dig in initially with the ethics and values class you taught for business and government affairs students in our program over many years, I think beginning in 1990. You've used a lot of different things. I know that Murder on the Orient Express was a movie you've shown. Could you talk about how you used that movie and the lesson you kind of drew out from students from that? Because I imagine a lot of people listening have seen at least one of the many versions of it.
Yeah. The one that I used was with the one that was made for television, and now I'm drawing a blank on the actor's name, David Suchet. I used the version with David Suchet, which is different from the version that Agatha Christie wrote, and that difference is the reason why I used that particular film version of it. Of course, they're on the Orient Express. Someone is murdered, and it turns out that 12 passengers, just the number that makes a jury, have combined together and plotted extensively to murder the victim on the train. And they want to murder him because he himself had murdered a young woman, a child, that he kidnapped, and they all had some connection with the child. But he managed to escape punishment through bribery and threats and so on. He was acquitted of the crime, and they want to do justice. And so the question then began, so they do justice, or they carry out their plan. They murder the criminal, the gangster who has done the kidnapping. And Poirot, the great detective, figures all this out, and then he reaches a moral dilemma. And this is the point, the moral dilemma. Do I turn these people in because they have violated the law? It's vigilante justice, he says. We're not primitive. We can't live like this. We must have the rule of law. Or on the other side, should he let them go because they have actually done justice in the world? And so I present the students with the moral dilemma. There it is. Now, Agatha Christie, God rest her soul, ducks the issue. For her, there's no question. Poirot lets them go, and there's no question about whether that should or should have been done. There's a little bit of that question in the Kenneth Branagh version, but it's the David Suchet version that really focuses on it. And I'm not so much interested in what the students think should be done. I think, and I wouldn't even venture to guess what they think should be done. The point is that I've tried to suggest to them is and this is part of the film. You see this film, the anguish that Poirot goes through before to make a decision, and that's what I want them to understand. If it's a serious moral question, it will be fraught with ambiguity. It will be painful to make the decision. And then, like Poirot, after he makes a decision, he decides to let them go. He still has second thoughts. The final scene in the movie is him walking away with his rosary beads in his hand, still praying, clearly not at all convinced that he made the right choice. And that was the point. That it's hard to make wise moral decisions, and you're always going to be if they're serious moral questions, you're always going to be second guessing yourself because there's no one answer to that question.
I apologize for not having said spoiler alert at the start of this discussion, but I tell you, having watched
all versions, he lets them go. Always.
Yeah, having watched it several times, it's a great watch, even knowing, that how it ends. And I can picture that scene in the snow with those rosary beads in his hand as he anguishes over this.
As you may know, we snuck my granddaughter Sophia into the class. Actually, I think it was the last year I taught it. And just recently, she read the novel, And she said, that novel, that's no good. They let the issue, she didn't engage with the moral issue. And I said to myself, well, maybe I taught somebody something along the line.
Yeah. Well, that does prompt great conversation in class. I know from experience. In Prague, in those early years, I should preface this by saying the board of the Fund for American Studies in 1991 suggested that the fund go explore the possibility of a program in the newly free countries of Central and Eastern Europe following the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you and I were part of that delegation with two trustees who visited what Václav Havel called the Wild, Wild East. Not long after those changes took place. It was a fascinating trip. I had just joined TFAS, and we went to Warsaw, Krakow, Budapest, and Prague, and met a number of interesting people. And I remember at Charles University, we met the newly elected dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, who had a business card that I still remember it. It was Dean Vladimir Suhy, and under his name it said window washer, because he had been a window washer in the days of communism. He wasn't allowed to hold an academic position. Fortunately, you never faced that dilemma as a dean at Georgetown.
You remember, too, he said, but that was all right because you had a lot of time to plot the revolution. You didn't have much to worry about.
Yeah. Well, that was a great trip, and it led to the start of our program in Prague that still goes on to this day. And you've taught over many decades there. It was interesting in those early days. We had an unair-conditioned classroom, so the windows had to stay open, and it was right above where the tram ran. The chalkboard, you had a bucket with a rag in it with water to clean the chalkboard. But you persevered, and you reached a lot of students with your teaching, and you called your course The Good Society. What led you to kind of choose that name for it, and tell us a little bit of what that course was about?
Well, it had many iterations, and part of the way I wound up teaching, I should give credit to my colleague at Georgetown, Frank Ambrosio, a philosopher who also contributed to the shaping and making of it. And that was the question we wanted to ask. There were, as you know, there were government classes, economics classes, but there was the other question, or kind of the humanistic question, or the philosophical question: what is the good society? And what we tried, I think, primarily to teach was the responsibility, not just of citizenship, but the responsibility of persons to act morally, to form a conscience, to struggle with the ambiguities of the moral and human ambiguities of the world in which we live, to form a conscience, and to have the commitment over a lifetime to re-question that conscience and to live by its precepts. What makes a good society, that I think of Thoreau, who said, a corporation has no conscience, but a corporation of conscientious men and women is a corporation with a conscience. A nation has no conscience, but a nation of conscientious men and women is a nation with a conscience. And thinking, and thinking in terms of a good society, a society that does justice to all its citizens. And that was the idea. And as I said, you can encapsulate the whole thing perhaps by quoting that great English philosopher, John Lennon. He said, "You've got to get down to your own God in your own church. It's down to you, mate. It's down to you. You want a better world? It's down to you." Maybe you don't make big changes, but we tried to convince them that even small incremental changes have impacts on the lives of people, and sometimes even on the course of history.
Yeah, and I know you talked often in that course about what appears to be a tension that exists between individualism on the one hand and the sense of community or obligations to others on the other hand. You illustrated that at times by showing clips from the movie Shane and High Noon. Could you talk about why you incorporated those two films?
Well, let me back up for a second. That idea of individual and society comes from Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address. He says, "This nation has kept, the way we govern ourselves has kept us both firm and free." In other words, we've honored the needs of the community for order and justice, and we've also honored the needs of the individual for liberty and freedom of conscience. And that's a tension that is shot through every society, every nation, I would say anyway. And what I often wanted the students to understand was that in America, we tend to celebrate the individual. Sometimes, I think, at the expense of the community, other times because the individual empowered should be celebrated. And so people like Shane, for example, are the great example of American individuals. They're self-reliant, they live alone, they never marry, they bring justice, some you might argue vigilante justice, but they bring justice to the world and then get on with their lives. But the American heroes are primarily individualistic heroes. And that's not only true about popular culture, Shane and John Wayne and those people, but it's also true about American literature. And I want students to realize that there's things in the culture, in the air we breathe, that we should be aware of. And that was a way of, I hope, to make them aware, and to, if they, and to realize that there's two sides to that individual and society question.
High Noon is the contrast, I guess, with Gary Cooper.
Yeah. Well, see, in those movies, the bad guys are always associated with the town, with the community, of the sissies who don't want to go out and be gunfighters, then run away. Those are the people associated with the town, the shopkeepers and so on. They depend upon this strong individual to protect them. And in some ways, that's not fair. It makes a great story, but it's not fair to the community in a way.
How did you find the students, especially those, not the Americans, but the students, particularly from in the early years from places like Romania and the former Soviet Union, and how'd they react to, these lessons that you and Frank would teach?
In a variety of ways, certainly. I think with all humility, they responded well to what we were trying to do. I must admit, over the years, I pulled back on the Western movies for the students who weren't American, because but some of them knew Clint Eastwood. So toward the end, I was using Clint Eastwood movies. But I pulled back on those because I'm not sure they were as effective. How did they respond in general? They were certainly willing. Once I made clear to them, I'm not here to impose or celebrate necessarily American values, but use them as illustrations of certain moral and social questions and political questions that you are facing in your own country. But let's find something neutral to talk about. And they, I think, responded very well to that kind of approach. We read Martin Luther King and the letter from the Birmingham jail, and the point was to show how King used the values of his society, both religious and political values, to validate his position and his quest for justice, hoping that there were comparable articulations in their societies that they could call upon to do the same thing, to, in a sense, to indict those people who are failing to live up to the promises and to the values, articulated promises and values of the society. And that, I think, worked very well, or worked well, I would say.
Another theme that I can pull out easily from your courses was this phrase, the murderous and the marvelous.
Well,
and I think almost every student who's in our programs who's taking your course, that stuck with them. Could you give us some background on that?
Yeah. Well, I cannot take credit for that. That was drawn from Seamus Heaney's Nobel lecture in 1995. And he talks about the famous story of the minibus that gets stopped along the road by.
And if I could just interject that for some people who may not know Seamus Heaney, poet who lived in Ireland, and I don't know if you want to give more background than that. I know you've brought him to Georgetown, I think, to speak, and whether that background's important, I don't know, but I thought I'd.
Well, to some degree, it is. He was, and maybe I don't. Maybe I ought not to tell the whole story about the in the Nobel lecture, and he's a poet who won the Nobel Prize. For many people, perhaps the best poet in the English-speaking world in the second half of the 20th century, for some people at least. But in any case, he tells the story of an atrocity that takes place in Ireland. Some people machine gunned along the side of the road. And the presumption of the people who are lined up to be machine gunned is that they are, the gunmen are, I may not remember it, the gunmen are Protestants, and the one among the workers who are lined up along the road is a Catholic. And as they're about to be executed, the Catholic feels somebody squeeze his hand. Don't worry, we won't betray you. Well, as it turns out, it's the other way around. The Protestants are massacred, the Catholic survived. And what Heaney is saying is, the gunfire is real, but so is the squeeze of the hand. The murderous is real, yes, but so is the marvelous. And we must make space, as he puts it, in our reckoning and imagining for the marvelous as well as for the murderous. And that's the way I started the class for years and years, saying basically to the kids, if you don't believe that, if you don't believe that I wish I could remember the other lines where poetry and history rhyme, or the idea, if you don't believe that there's a possibility of goodness, of progress, of some change, if you don't believe in the marvelous, then you might as well go home, because you will live in despair. The idea is, don't presume, it's a murderous world, but don't despair either. Make space for the marvelous. And that's the way we began. You've got to begin with that hope. And you hear that from Havel, you hear that from Athol Fugard, another writer we talked about. This idea that you must have some grounded in the sense of, not silly optimism, but some grounded sense of possibility. Do not presume, do not despair.
Yeah, that no doubt is powerful in a classroom where at times you've had students who come from countries that might have been at war with each other or had great tensions with, Israelis and Palestinians and Croats and Serbs and Bosnian students and other conflicts, both in Prague and in the program we had in Greece a few years ago. To begin with that is probably an important message to have the students address, right?
Yes. The other thing we did that I stole from Seamus Heaney, he talks about local stories, myths, stories, and stories in the largest sense. And tell them, and we used to try to suggest that the stories that we tell the Bible, the Quran, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, other great works of scripture and literature. The stories we tell remind us that we're different. But what those stories reflect, the questions that they're trying to answer, the human issues that they're dealing with, are what join us together. Because across cultures are differences, but also across cultures are a shared desire to find answers to fundamental human questions: death, love, how should we organize ourselves as a society? We tell stories in answer to those questions, but we all share the questions. And in a secular age, in the postmodern world, some people said, yes, what we share is we're all children of God, and that was hopeful. Or some said, yes, what we share is human nature. But you can't rely on that, because in many areas, those are discredited concepts. So we look for something that you might be able to get everybody in the class to buy into.
I very much recall one of the very early programs we did in Greece. This would have been in the late 1990s. At the closing ceremony, one of the Turkish students who you had in your class got up to say how much he came to appreciate the value of the program, that he had formed a bond, a friendship with one of the Greek students. And being from Turkey, he thought he would never say anything along these lines, that he had a friend he loved from Greece. And it was just a marvelous testimonial to what we were trying to accomplish at that program. And I asked him afterwards if he could put that in writing for us to use as a testimonial to show our donors the importance of the program. And he said, "Are you kidding? If I was identified with the statement I made, I'd get in trouble back in Turkey with my friends." And so he wasn't quite ready to go public with it, but he came there, and like you were just saying, I mean, he realized how much he had in common with a classmate. Their cultures are somewhat similar, their food, their music.
Yes.
The Turk and Greek had more in common than, say, they had with the Croat or the Palestinian or the Egyptian, certainly. And I think that was the value of your course and that program, as well as in Prague, of helping these young people realize that they do have common questions they have to answer.
I remember Randall Teague, our chairman, saying, "Let's hope, though, that 10 years, 20 years from now, they'll remember that, pick up the phone and prevent the war." Right. Speaking metaphorically, but we would hope they would remember that. Yeah. We set off, I always think of this, we set off in 1992 or 1, when we did our trip to Eastern Europe, right, shortly after the war. We set off with such bright hopes and maybe not expectation, but bright hopes and bright dreams. And I guess some of them actually have come true, although many of them have not.
Yeah, I think we were told it was the end of history.
That's right. How foolish we were. We should have known better.
Let me ask just a broad question, which could apply to TFAS programs or your teaching in general. How have you, if at all, seen students change over the years? Teaching at Georgetown for 40 years almost. Do you find that students come with the same questions and concerns in life, or maybe they're less prepared for what you do in the classroom? But can you reflect more broadly about that?
I would say at Georgetown, I wouldn't say they were any less well prepared. I got to Georgetown and started teaching there in 1982 and gave up in 2020. So I wouldn't say they were less well prepared. They may not have as rich a background in humanistic things. They were not certainly um, experts in Greek mythology in 1981. Part of the problem is they know things you don't know, and you know things they don't know. So it's easy to say, well, they don't know anything anymore. I wouldn't say that's true. They're certainly as well prepared. The difference that I saw is much more pragmatic. The a grade is much more important because that's what gets you into law school or gets you a job with Morgan Stanley or whatever it is you're interested in. So that and the statistics nationwide tell you that. Was it 4% of the graduates last year majored in history, philosophy, or English? I think it was that. I just read the statistic. It might have been a little more, but certainly very few students are majoring in the traditional humanities. And that's what sort of I've seen over the years. And the other problem, at least in my discipline, is that I want to put this not too controversially, or I try to be polite, is that the drift has been from literature to what we call now, or what is called now, I should say, cultural studies. And I think that's, I think on that we agree that is a great loss that so many people who profess the humanities are not teaching literature anymore, but teaching something they would call cultural studies.
Well, that brings up an obvious question, I guess, as someone who's absorbed much of their career in Shakespeare. Is Shakespeare relevant today? He seemed to be for several centuries at least, and today there seems to be an attitude in much of academia that he doesn't have much to teach us, I suppose, and that may go as well for works like Antigone that you use. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, I know the obvious answer you'd give probably, but I'm curious.
Shakespeare has become, as they say fashionably, a site now for kind of political discussions. To put that yes, Shakespeare. Well, for some people, Shakespeare has relevance because he can tell us things about the world in which we live. Political issues, social issues, gender, race, and Shakespeare has, depending who you ask, is either a negative example or a positive example. To make either for I have taught The Merchant of Venice. For some people, that play is, I don't think it is, but for some people, it is inescapably anti-Semitic, and it is therefore used as to serve certain political purposes. For other people, the play is extraordinarily inclusive, as we say now, which I think it is. It's not just because I don't want people to think Shakespeare was anti-Semitic. It's because I read the play that way, and it seems very clear that it is not an anti-Semitic play. And so I teach from that point of view. So, yes, Shakespeare still has relevance, but for some it's kind of, if you like, a negative relevance. He's representing things that are abhorrent. And the obvious plays are The Merchant of Venice, for example, Othello, and then there are other plays as well. And it really rests on the interpretation of the person, I think. But from another point of view, Shakespeare is not often in the curriculum. That wasn't put right. Very often you can major in English and not take a course in Shakespeare. Sometimes because it's just irrelevant, and sometimes because it's pernicious.
Well, you mentioned that in comparing students today with students in the past, that what they know, it's not that they know less, it's what they know is different. And I remember you telling me once about the time that you vividly remember, I think mentioning the Vietnam War in class and seeing the students' eyes glaze over, thinking you're talking ancient history, and here this event that was one of the most formative events in your life and my generation was something that students today,
Yeah, somebody else's war.
But you've been, as is shown by your comments already today, you've been great at adapting your curriculum and your stories and your lessons over the years to make them relevant to students today. Is social media having a pernicious effect on this generation, you think, in terms of their academic performance? I know one of your colleagues, for instance, who teaches with us over the years, Joshua Mitchell from the government department, once said he tells his students, Facebook is death.
Yes.
Turn off Facebook. Put your cell phones down. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the problem is that so much misinformation and disinformation is being spread on social media. Just listening to the radio this morning, newspapers are in desperate situation. Nobody reads the newspaper, and they get news, such as it is, true or false, from these social media sites. And I think it's dangerous. I really do. And the other problem is, of course, everybody's constantly checking to see what the latest news is on their cell phone, and they've forgotten how to talk to one another. You see families, 4 people, 5 people, all playing with their phones, and you want to say, talk to one another. But putting that aside, I think there is a real threat that responsible journalists and responsible journalism is being shunted off to the side, and people are getting news from less than reliable sources. And if I would have one other thing to say about that, don't let the old song, don't let your sons grow up to be cowboys. Don't let your sons grow up without taking history. Take history. Learn about the past. And understand by learning about the past, you'll understand a lot about the present. And that worries me.
Yeah, that's important.
A friend of mine who teaches in the English department said, forget English, take history.
Well, your influence at Georgetown has been great. I have to mention I had lunch with a Georgetown graduate today, and at the end of lunch I was excusing myself, and I said I've got to go to our studio to record our Liberty and Leadership podcast with a professor who's taught for us, and in fact taught at Georgetown. You might know him. And then I said, oh wait, you graduated with Bill Clinton in 1968, so you wouldn't have had him. He said, well, what's his name? And I said, Michael Collins. He said, oh, sure. He was the dean. And I remember doing a literary tour of Paris that he led.
Yes.
And I said, that's right. You've done these alumni college programs around the country, around the world. You've done a lot in your career that involved international programming. You were responsible for the Georgetown Villa in Fiesole, Italy. You've done a lot in London at the Globe Theatre and worked with colleagues in the UK. That's been probably not something you were contemplating as a student studying English literature. Could you reflect on those experiences in general?
Yeah, well, curiosity, I would say, is what drives it. But a friend of mine who had a PhD, got a PhD in English, he worked with me at Georgetown, and he said, I had a PhD in English literature before I ever went to England. He said, that's crazy. And in some ways, going to England helped, even as a young man, helped me to kind of understand what I was trying to understand better. But also, I think it's important for the students, and that's why I supported all those programs. It's important for students to have some sense of the global reality in which we live. I think only 1/3 of all Americans have a passport, something like that, maybe a little more. But you say so many people have never Now, some have never had the opportunity, but some people have had the opportunity and haven't taken it. And I think as a result, their vision of the world, their imaginative capacity, is limited by the fact they haven't traveled and seen different things. You don't have to go and and live in a French village for 6 months or anything like that, but just to go and do some of the major tourist things, see some of the great works of our time, and I say of our culture. This is all very important, and for students and for citizens to have just a wider sense of the world, and that it can't hurt you, and it might very well help you.
I've been handed a note by the engineer that we've coming up on our time limit, and I have trouble believing it because it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. And I would like to ask you to reflect on another story before we close, and that's a story you often tell to all of our students at in the program by Athol Fugard, who you mentioned earlier, South African playwright. My Children, My Africa, is that the name of it?
Yes, that was one of his plays. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk about how you use that story in with our students?
Yeah, well, this actually, what Fugard came to Georgetown and gave a talk. We asked a number of distinguished people to choose a book that meant something to them. Fugard chose Thoreau's Walden, and he told how he was depressed. His play wasn't going well. South Africa was a mess, he said, and he was in great despair. And then he read Thoreau about the ability to shape the day. No matter what the circumstances are, you find yourself, an individual has the ability to affect the quality of the day. I think that's exactly the way it was put, and the point was, what it was that, and he goes on to say that, I am responsible for my soul. And nobody can interfere with that unless I let them. And what we were trying to get the students to understand is the difference between freedom and liberty. People can constrain your liberty. They can put you in jail. They can pass a law that says you can't do this justly or unjustly, but they cannot take away your freedom. They cannot take away your freedom to respond, your choice of how to respond to the situation in which you find yourself. And of course, a great example of that was Viktor Frankl. But what we wanted the students to understand is they don't have to be, in the end, prisoners. They have freedom of conscience. They have the freedom to respond. They always have something of themselves that has autonomy and independence. And it took some time for them, because many languages don't even have a distinction between freedom and liberty. It took some time to get them to see it, but they did. I remember explaining and re-explaining it to them. And of course, some of them were skeptical. Oh, that's not true. They can drug you and so on. But we said, look, you're never, ever without your freedom to respond to the situation in which you find yourself. And I hope that did them some good as well. And that's really what freedom means. I used to say, the Fund for American Studies, we teach freedom. That's what freedom means. We also teach liberty, but if we teach freedom, that's what freedom means.
Well, Mike Collins, this has been such a pleasure. We've only scratched the surface of what you've taught in the classroom over the years, the lessons you've conveyed to students. But I think this has been at least a small sample of the importance of the programs we do, and having professors such as you in the classroom with students will be leaders in the future, helping them develop and have a moral compass, develop courage to make a difference, and to live lives as free individuals, even if they don't have the kind of liberty that we might wish they had in many places in this world. So thank you for your service with TFAS. I hope it will continue in other capacities going forward now that you've retired as a professor in the classroom, because you still have so much to impart on young people, and we'll be calling on you to continue to offer those lessons to our alumni and our students in the future.
I would be happy to, and thank you for having me. I'm honored to think you think I'm worth listening to for an hour. So thank you very much, and for your very generous words about my work of teaching. So,
well, I know what we do is worth it, because we've given you an opportunity beyond the classroom at Georgetown to reach students around the world, and so thank you for taking time away from home in the summers to teach around the world, Mike. It's been a pleasure. All the best to you, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Liberty and Leadership Podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe, download, like, or share the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you like this episode, I ask you to rate and review it. And if you have a comment or question for the show, please drop us an email at podcast@tfas.org. The Liberty and Leadership Podcast is produced at K Global Studios in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Roger Ream, and until next time, show courage in things large and small.